Hi, everyone. I'm Emily, and I'm a second-year MFA candidate in photography at Louisiana State, and I wanted to thank MSJE for the opportunity to present my work here today. Before I begin, I do want to note that this presentation does touch on issues of white supremacy and violence, just as a heads up.
On your screen. Look at that.
So this might be a familiar sight for some of you. It's Torah Synagogue right here in New Orleans. My work is a collection of black and white images and oral history audio recordings exploring the Jewish experience in the Deep South. I want to show you some of the work I made prior to the summer research that I'll be talking about today, just to give a little background. This was one of my first photographs I made when I began the research just over a year ago. At the time, I was an MA candidate in Southern Studies at the University of Mississippi. The program was really wonderful, and although I did decide to transfer to LSU to be in a studio arts program, my time at UM was essential. The time at UM grounded me in the cross-disciplinary methodologies often employed in cultural studies, in this case, Southern Studies. The faculty and documentarians at the Southern Documentary Project and Southern Foodways Alliance equipped me with the tools necessary to do the kind of fieldwork that I'm now doing. I came to graduate school with a background in photography and history, but it was at the University of Mississippi that I learned to conduct oral histories and develop the technical skills necessary to record and process them. The time in Oxford was essential in other ways. I think had I not moved to a small town in Mississippi, I would have never made the work. I'm from Chicago, went to college in Philadelphia, and then moved to New Orleans. Prior to Oxford, I'd never lived somewhere without a really large Jewish community. So as I mentioned, the work is a body of analog black and white images and oral histories. The title is actually a line pulled directly from an oral history interview. The work explores the Jewish experience in the Deep South, broadly speaking, including historical and contemporary racial identity and place, by which I mean both the literal spaces that Jews occupied or live now, and their place within the Southern social landscape, a landscape in which race and religion are often pretty important. For as long as there have been Southerners, there have been Southern Jews. An understudied and to some an entirely unknown community, Jews have occupied an unsteady, undefined place in the Deep South's perceived racial binary. They have very frequently attained a degree of provisional whiteness and benefited from the privileges that come with it, only to be periodically reminded that through acts of anti-Semitism, that their acceptance into whiteness is sometimes tenuous. The goals of the work are then twofold: to preserve the memory of Jewish communities where they no longer exist, and to understand the Jewish experience today. So in undergrad, I read Silencing the Past, a book by Michel Rolfe-Trouillot, a Haitian anthropologist. And he talks about bundles of silences in the historical narrative created when certain voices are silenced, when the archive is created. So it's my goal to begin filling this particular silence in the Southern archive with the voices of those who have deep roots in this place, but who are sometimes left out of its history and present. My images seek to create a more complete story. The work is a record of places where Jews once raised their families, built their businesses, prayed, lived, and died. It's also a record of the places where Jews remain. The pairing of these images and oral histories creates an immersive experience for the viewer. By viewing these places while listening to the voices of people who won't forget them, the stories become individual and personal, pulling them out of broader historical trends and statistics. So as I mentioned before, I'm from Chicago, and I feel this is not my story to tell alone. Instead, I see my role as that of an artist, gatherer, and archivist. Although I'm not from the region, I'm deeply invested in Jewish voices being a part of the Southern story, in no small part because I'm Jewish myself. My work is informed by our traditions, practices, and culture, which are often tacitly undercut by a fear of disappearing, a fear that sometimes seems entirely reasonable as a population making up less than 0.2% of the world. It's with that in mind that I pursue this work, gathering these stories and documenting these places. Every school auditorium that was once a synagogue, parking lot that was once a Jewish family's department store, and cemetery so overgrown that the grave markers are barely visible. so that these stories are brought to the fore of the Southern story today, and so that people might not forget that we once lived in places like Osaka, Mississippi, and Clinton, Louisiana. So here's a few stats on my summer research. It was a month-long trip, primarily in Alabama, although I did go to a few places in Mississippi and hopped over the border into Columbus, Georgia for one day. And here's the route I took. I only spent a couple of days in each town, although there are a few exceptions. And here's a map. While on the road, I thought I would be camping most nights and was really touched by the kindness of those who I interviewed. Many of them welcomed me into their homes, fed me, and offered me their guest bed or sofa. We all know how incredibly hot it can be here in the summer, so you can imagine that was always a welcome relief. I actually only ended up camping one night outside of Huntsville, Alabama, and naturally there was a giant thunderstorm. I hit the road on July 10th, and I was really nervous to go on this month-long solo trip. I'd done a couple of other photo trips during the school year, but this was the longest by far. Prior to that, the longest one had been something like 72 hours. When I hit the road, I had 3 places that I knew I would be staying overnight, indoors: Birmingham, Montgomery, and Eufaula. I looked up campsites for my other destinations, but if any of you have ever just gone to a campsite for the first time, you know that what you see on the internet is not always what you get. So as you can see, I packed the Prius to the brim with anything I could possibly need: camp stove, tent, cameras, tripod, cooler full of film, recording equipment, lifetime supply of hot Cheetos, and the ultimate safety gear, an MSJE superfan, Huey the Penguin. Here's Huey and I making it to Mississippi on day 1. So after stopping in Hattiesburg and Laurel to photograph, I made it up to Meridian, where I met Scott Strasser. I was put in touch with Scott via word of mouth, which is the way I met almost all of my interview subjects. In this case, I reached out to Dr. Josh Parshall at the Institute of Southern Jewish Life to see if he knew anyone at Beth Israel, Meridian Synagogue. Dr. Parshall put me in touch with Michelle Schipper, the CEO of the ISJL, who put me in touch with Scott. A few degrees of separation was pretty typical from my interview subjects and I. I met Scott at the cemetery, where he showed me around both the Reform and Orthodox sections that are across the street from one another. I was struck by the headstones. As you can see here, there's a female figure on the headstone of the grave of M. Meyer. This imagery isn't typically found in Jewish cemeteries, more frequently found in Christian cemeteries. You can see in the back the 3 gravestones that are much more typical and plain. Jews in small towns often needed to assimilate for survival, and assimilation is, of course, a double-edged sword. It allows for a much greater degree of safety, especially for those of us who look white, and many of us do, but it comes at a cost. That is the loss of culture, traditions, language, foodways, etc. And I think this image illustrates the effects and perhaps the pressure to assimilate even in death. Scott was really generous with his time. After showing me around the cemetery, we went to Beth Israel. I was struck by how hidden the building is. It's in a really residential area, and Scott had to unlock a gate for us to drive down to the synagogue, which is kind of set back off of the main road. He told me about the shrinking congregation and all the work he and the other synagogue members were doing to keep it going. He also spoke really candidly about how he knew that 20 years from now, the congregation would likely no longer exist and what they should do with the building when that time comes. Many of you have maybe already heard of Beth Israel in Meridian. It's famous for being bombed in 1968 by the Klan. This is an image of the lot where the education building used to be. Although Scott wasn't born yet, he told me about how Beth Israel was really outspoken against the Klan during the Civil Rights era, especially when it came to the Klan bombing Black churches. I wanted to share a little audio clip of Scott talking about what led up to the bombing. The audio cuts in with Scott talking about Northern workers who came down to try to register Black voters.
that kicked off a lot of anti-Semitism, but it was based mainly on the fact the Jewish congregation here, and this is something that's not been said that often, and I'll say it, coming from my grandfather, of course, I wasn't born, this is early to mid-60s. The Jewish congregation put up a bunch of money and rebuilt the churches. And they felt that, that this was caused by a Jewish person. He wouldn't listen, he should have left, didn't understand, all those things were absolutely true, but they rebuilt the churches. And that kicked off a huge wave of anti-Semitism. There were black churches that were burned in both Neshoba County, I believe, and here in Lauderdale County. And that so the anti-Semitism started there, very outward anti-Semitism.
Yeah.
The mayor at that time of Meridian was Jewish. And he was a no back down, no back down in that man, no back down in his daughter, who's still a friend of mine to this day. She spent 2 years sleeping with a sawed-off shotgun underneath her pillow, which she still has, which she don't think sleeps with anymore, but it's where she can get it, I can promise you, and promise you it's loaded. But that was when a lot of the anti-Semitism started, because they felt that we, as the Jewish community, were interfering with them, keeping everything the way they wanted it, which was certainly not having African Americans registered to vote. There were just absurd Jim Crow laws that they came up with, and voter registration laws, and I don't know if this one's an Alabama one or the one of the Mississippi ones, but you had to be able to recite every county alphabetically and the county seat, and it's just impossible stuff. And with the Kennedys and with what was going on, it was clear that it was not going to stay this way.
So in retaliation to the activism of the Jewish community and supporting the Black community, members of the Klan came in from out of town, and Scott did make sure to let me know that they were coming in from out of town, and threatened multiple outspoken Jewish residents, including the mayor and his family, as Scott mentioned, and blew up the education building with 15 sticks of dynamite. The blast rocked the foundation of the entire synagogue, and even today, the congregation hasn't been able to fully fix that foundation. And stained glass salvaged from the education building now adorns the back of the sanctuary. So the first night I had been planning to camp, but when Scott and his wife Emily caught wind of that, they kindly offered me their guest bedroom. Scott did tell me that if I really needed to camp, he had 200 acres of land and I could go camp there. I chose the guest bedroom. After a good night's sleep, I went into town to photograph other Jewish sites. So here's the Baum block, which used to be owned by Joseph Baum, who immigrated from Prussia in the 1870s. And this building was home to several Jewish family-owned stores, including dry goods and grocery stores. As you can see now, it's been demolished, although I think the demolition was recent and ongoing. I want to talk a little bit about how I find these sites to photograph. For each town, I start out by reading the entry on the ISJL Encyclopedia of Southern Jewish Communities. So here's a screen grab from Meridians. I'll write down all the names of the families and buildings that each entry mentions, and then I'll go back through those notes, usually starting with a simple Google search. And here's a little snapshot of what that list looks like. Please pardon any spelling errors. Usually the Google search doesn't come back with too much, but in this case it did. So to have a modern photograph of the building makes things about as easy for me as they can get. But as you saw in the last photo, when I got there, the building was no longer standing. That happened a few times, but in this case, because I had this image, I was actually able to find a little sliver of the green and red paint that was on the outside of this building that indicated that the demolished building was in fact the Baum block. If the Google search doesn't come back with an address, I usually look at newspapers and city archives. Often advertisements for stores will either provide a full address, like these advertisements from papers in Hattiesburg and Laurel, Mississippi, or at least a street corner. When I get to the site, I'll photograph with both my 35mm and medium format cameras. As it turns out, analog cameras don't save any metadata for you. So I will also take a photograph on my iPhone and write in the notes the name of the building. And the phone automatically saves location data and the date, so I can refer back to this when I process the negatives. After a few more days on the road through Mississippi and Alabama, I made it to Jasper. My first stop was the home of Mr. Fred May, the last remaining Jew in Jasper. I was put in touch with him by both his sister Marlene and my friend Carly. I think that speaks to just how close-knit the Southern Jewish community is. I started out this trip with something like 3 or 4 contacts, and that blossomed into 25 interviews, and I think if I had had the time, I could have done 25 more. Jasper is 151 miles, or about a 2.5-hour drive from Meridian, so not that far. However, Fred's experience as a Jew in Jasper was vastly different than that of Scott's in Meridian, and I'd like to share a clip of that now.
We spoke earlier a little bit about the absence, I think, of anti-Semitism, or at least we weren't aware of it growing up. It might have been there, but we didn't see it. It was not pronounced. So we felt very comfortable, very welcomed into pretty much every group we wanted to join. The Jews were prominent members of the country club here. They were, we weren't founding members, but we were, you know, I know we had at least 3 Jewish presidents of the country club here. We were accepted and welcomed. It was the overwhelming feeling that I got in the Jasper society.
I think it's important to note that when Fred says that they felt welcome anywhere in any group they wanted to, he's talking about white spaces. He experienced this really profound acceptance into whiteness that comes with a set of privileges. And this set of privileges almost always came at the expense of the Black community. The country club is also a theme I'd like to touch on. This was a recurring theme in a lot of interviews, and it seemed to me to be a metaphor for the degree of acceptance. While Jews were almost always considered white in the public sphere, think things like schools, drinking fountains, stores, swimming pools, oftentimes they weren't allowed in the country clubs, even if they were quite wealthy. Some places, like Montgomery, they started their own. Some places they didn't. Whether it's because they didn't want to or the communities were simply too small, I don't always know. It is notable, though, that Fred and his acceptance into Jasper's community, they were so readily accepted into the country club, and indicates a really kind of complete exception into whiteness. So after our interview, Fred offered to show me around the town, and we hopped in his truck, cameras in tow. First, we went to the cemetery and then the synagogue, which is now a real estate office, although the exterior is entirely intact. We drove down the main street of Jasper, where Fred pointed out every storefront that was once owned by a Jewish family. So this is a close-up of the window on Top Dollar, a long-shuttered Jewish-owned store. I had similar experiences in Selma, Eufaula, and Clayton, where interviewees generously showed me around the town and pointed out all the Jewish-owned stores. And of course, we stopped by his family's store. So this is G. May & Sons Furniture. They had several storefronts in Jasper. I hit the road again, photographing and interviewing along the way, and on July 29th, I met our very own Abby in Eufaula. Abby made the trek all the way from New Orleans and introduced me to her mother, Lisa, and her grandmother, Sandra. So here they are in front of one of their family's old stores in Eufaula. Abby and her family showed me around Eufaula and Clayton, and Abby even took me on a trip to Columbus, Georgia, to show me her childhood congregation. although they have since moved buildings. This is the interior of the new building. The Lewis Gullidge family lives in Eufaula now and has deep roots both there and in Clayton, about a half-hour drive away. It is in Clayton that Gullidge Dry Goods is located. The property is still owned by the family, although it's now closed. While operational, Gullidge Dry Goods primarily served the Black community of Clayton. I want to share a quick clip of Sandra talking about the store.
So when my husband and I married and we moved to Clayton, we put in a store in Clayton. And first we worked for Mother. She had a store downtown. And then we built our own place it's still in the city limits, but about 3 miles out of town, and stayed there for 50 years. And he and I ran it with the girls. They were always, I have 3 girls. Lisa, who's Abby's mother, and Sarah is the middle, and Brenda was the baby. And from the time they could count change, they worked in the store. We had an old cash register that you turned the crank on instead of still doing that. In fact, in my dreams, sometimes my arm hurts. I think about ringing that cash. And it had no tape. It had a place for one, but we had never used one. And so you'd read the total in the morning, and then you'd read it at night, and then that's what you took in that day. And nobody could prove that you didn't. So that's the way we ran it. We had in Clayton an all-purpose type store. We had hardware, we had furniture, we had used cars, we had coin laundry. That was another thing in the 60s. They wouldn't let blacks use the same wash and carry as the white people.
So it was pretty common for Jewish stores to serve a Black clientele, not just in Clayton, but all over the South. In other parts of the interview I conducted with Sandra, she talks about how she saw herself as white and was very much a part of white society. And like Fred May and Jasper, the country club surfaces for her too. However, at one point, she says that they didn't belong to the country club. And she says she doesn't know if it was because her family wasn't welcome or they just didn't care to join. After Eufaula, I headed back to Montgomery with the intention to photograph and interview a little bit more before heading to my final destination in Dothan. Unfortunately, a dear professor of mine, Dr. David Wharton from University of Mississippi, got sick, and I went instead to Oxford to visit him. He passed late September this year on Erev Rosh Hashanah, and I wanted to dedicate this portion of the work to him. He was a great photographer who spent his career documenting the small town South. And those of us who were lucky enough to be his students learned a great deal from his abilities to slow down, notice, and tell the stories of the towns he photographed. When I'm out on the road, I think of him a lot. Back in Baton Rouge, I spent the last few months developing film, scanning negatives, printing and processing the audio, and planning my next trip, which will be to Texas. I'm so excited to be heading to Texas over winter break, thanks in part to the generous support of the Southern Jewish Historical Society. And the last thing I want to say is this is collaborative work. I couldn't have done any of it without the generosity and openness of the Southern Jewish community. Everyone has shared their stories with me, and I feel really deeply in debt to them. And thank you so much to all of these people. And if there's time, I can take a question.
Yeah, absolutely, it's time. So let's open it up first, and I hope the people on the Zoom can hear my voice. Oh, can they?
You can come here.
I could go up there, yeah. And we'll take some questions first. We'll take some questions first from people in our audience here today. And then as questions come in via chat, I will voice them to Emily. So open it up. You can call people.
Where do you plan to take the work next? Like you've gone through Alabama, like where next?
Well, I'm going to Texas. I will probably mostly focus on East Texas because that's more culturally as part of the Deep South. I don't have the exact itinerary yet.
2 questions. 1, Huey the penguin, Huey Long? Huey Newton, great. And and the second question is more relevant. In front of you, you have 2 cameras. And I'm wondering how you choose which camera to shoot on and why those cameras, and to bother you to show the people the brilliant camera side too.
So I do have 2 cameras. This is a Rolleiflex. It was my grandfather's. This is a medium format camera, so it's a larger negative and they're square. And this was my father's 35mm camera. I kind of assess when I'm at the place what makes the most sense. Usually I'm looking at like the different aspect ratio, because one of them, the Rolleiflex, is a square, and then the 35mm I can change out lenses to have either a wide angle or a normal lens, 50mm, which is close to what your eye sees. And it has like a kind of a 2:3 aspect ratio. So it just depends on what makes the most sense.
We do have a question online. Do you know the approximate population of Eufaula?
Oh, I don't, but Abby might.
I can get you an answer before the end of this. Yeah. My mom is probably saying that over the Zoom right now, knowing that she can't be heard.
We have more questions for like okay. I was curious as to what you've seen become of most of the former synagogue buildings you've encountered in your research. I found quite a few of them in South Texas that were sold to Christian congregations and churches.
Yeah, that's a really common one. I think I showed it earlier. I'll go back to it. In South Texas, actually, I took a trip there. This is like all the way at the beginning. Bear with me. So a lot of them do become churches. This was Rodef Shalom in Port Arthur. It's now a Spanish-speaking church. What's really interesting is they kept the original lettering from Rodef Shalom and presumably got some of that custom made to say Templo. I see a lot of that, a lot of churches, and also kind of any number of things. The real estate office one was interesting. There's one that has been turned into a police supply store. We have one down the road in Donaldsonville that's now an Ace Hardware. So you kind of see all kinds of things with the synagogues.
You're shooting in black and white predominantly. But what happens when you mention it's like green and red paint?
That was just a visual indicator to me that I was in the right place because the building had been demolished.
Is that showing a significance to you as the artist? Is showing a show it's what when you today?
What?
Is it showing a significance of the artist? Show how it reveals the color and maybe it's getting demolished. Like, does the color play importance in something like that incident?
I guess it could if I were a different artist. I'm interested in the black and white because I want to nod to that historical process since I'm making work about history. So I typically like print in a black and white, like a wet dark room. I think maybe if I had access to a colored dark room, that color would be more important.
The population of Eufaula currently is 11,000.
Eufaula is 11,000 if you couldn't hear Happy. Thank you.
I'm just going to share a few more comments from the chat. Susan Richards asked if you're familiar with the book Wandering Dixie by Sue Eisenfeld.
Yes.
You are, great.
Dale recommended that to me. Thank you.
And then what was the statue of the grave site? Is there a different iconography within the bounds of assimilation? Somebody asked.
Is there different iconography within the bounds?
Mhm.
Like, as in, is that present other places or not?
So I think the first, what was the statue at the gravesite?
Oh,
And then, yeah.
okay. It looked to me like an angel. I don't actually know. I haven't researched that grave specifically. Angels are not commonly found in Jewish iconography. I think there is other things that are more common in Jewish cemeteries in the South. You see a lot of imagery from Freemasons and Goodfellas, which indicates assimilation, but was like super common for Jews in these places to join societies like that.
And I guess it's more of a question probably for research to consider, but the different iconography within the bounds of assimilation, something perhaps to consider later.
I have a question. Hi, Emily. As someone who went through this journey with you for a small portion of your trip, and for someone who thinks the research as that I do from Alabama is incredibly important, I'd love for you to talk a little bit more about the economic and mental toll that it has on the artist to do something like this, because I think it's really important to have this kind of research, but without researchers, we don't have that. So I think it'd be really cool if you could share a little bit of that experience.
Oh, thank you, Abby. It was tough. I gave up my lease for the summer, so I wouldn't have to worry about paying rent, and stayed with a couple of friends before hitting the road. But it's costly, especially with purchasing film and recording equipment and things of that nature. And then, of course, this was at the time where gas was super expensive. And I drive a Prius, but I was still driving thousands of miles. So that became really expensive. And then even with campsites, there's often a fee. And I was lucky to have a lot of really generous people who allowed me to stay with them. But there are sometimes places that I go, and I anticipate this happening in Texas, where things are a little bit more far-flung, where there isn't going to be anyone for me to interview, and I'll have to find some kind of lodging. And it's exhausting mentally. Oral history interviews take a lot of attention. You have to pay very close attention. You want to be really engaged with whoever you're interviewing. And then with photographing, it's like 1,000 degrees outside, and I'm carrying all of my own equipment. I'm a one-person show. So there's a lot of back and forth between me and the car, and then there's an immense amount of research to like make the Google map to find the places. And on this trip, I had actually been doing some freelance work for the Southern Foodways Alliance. So while conducting this research, I was editing a bunch of photos to turn over to them so I could fund my own research.
And twofold, could you maybe talk a little bit about the difference between previous experiences and this one as traveling through a pandemic? I mean, we all know that Alabama is not specifically coherent when it comes to the precautions of COVID, but I would love to hear your opinions of like if you thought that there was a huge difference in your comfortability of staying in people's homes in the midst of the pandemic.
I mean, this was my first like big trip, so I don't have to like a real good point of comparison. I got my booster shot and hoped for the best. I kind of assumed I would get COVID on this trip, and I didn't, thank God. But I think it is kind of this inherent risk that is just a part of the research right now, unfortunately.
I'm curious what it was like going around places when you didn't have a tour guide showing you around, and even when you did, if you had moments of interacting with folks just around these places who were curious about what you were doing or just reacting in any way.
Yeah. Without a tour guide, it's like a lot more legwork to figure out where I'm gonna go. And that just takes a ton of time to like do all of that research. Not too many people interacted with me, which was a little surprising. I did have one experience in a very small town with no Jewish population left, where I sort of got the stink eye, and someone was like, "What are you doing here?" And sometimes people will stop and ask about the camera. This is an object of attention in 2022 because you don't see that a lot, but mostly it was just like really hot.
someone says, thank you for your presentation. It was very interesting. And they asked, did anyone that you interview refer to ancestors who began as peddlers, especially in Mississippi?
Almost everyone. That is like part of the reason I wanted to share Abby's family story is that's a very common story. I don't play the whole interview, but Abby has ancestors who started out as peddlers and then kind of came up in on the story. Carly, that almost everybody does. And this is a Southern Jewish story, but that's also kind of the American Jewish story. I too have family that started out as peddlers in the Midwest. Yes, so like I would say 95% of the people who I interviewed made some mention of that. I think the one who didn't was like 14 and definitely has those ancestors.
I'll keep asking questions from the chat. How old were these Jewish communities, and do the children come back after college?
Very old. A lot of them dated back to like the mid 1800s, sometimes a little earlier even. Around Meridian is like even earlier than that, although this is like pre-establishment of Meridian. In places like Birmingham, people are more likely to come back, but often these communities the synagogue members are older and people aren't coming back. A lot of that is lack of economic opportunity.
Someone shares they mostly know about Southern Jewish life from the trilogy of Alfred Horry's plays. During your travels, have you been able to document secular Jewish community life, like old Yiddish theaters or Jewish social halls?
Whenever I can find them, yes. A lot of the like more secular aspects of the storefronts, I do kind of like the three main categories that the work falls into are cemeteries, synagogues, and storefronts. So storefronts are pretty secular, I guess.
Sounds like the name of the book.
Forthcoming.
I know that you visited Tuscaloosa. Can you talk a little bit about what it was like to visit a place where the permanent Jewish community is so small, but there is a thriving Jewish community based on a student base?
Yeah, it was really interesting. I was pleasantly surprised in Tuscaloosa because I was able to kind of interact with people from both the like permanent, long-time Tuscaloosa resident side of things and students. Tuscaloosa was it was thriving, and what's interesting in Tuscaloosa is those communities have kind of merged in a way that a lot of times college communities and the community that they're in don't work together. So the Hillel and synagogue in Tuscaloosa are connected. There's just a little courtyard in between. So they were really lovely over there and seem to be going strong. Which is similar to Auburn, actually. Sorry. Auburn also is one of those communities in a smaller town that is sustained mostly because there's a university there. And Tuscaloosa was also interesting. They have a big Jewish community and a big Jewish student population, in part because in the time where there were quotas on Jewish students, Bama didn't have one. And so a lot of people from the north were sending their Jewish kids down to Bama because there was no quota. And so there was a thriving community, and mom and dad want their kid to keep their Jewish identity. So they send them to Bama.
Did any of the old synagogue buildings become local history museums as has happened in the Midwest?
Not that I found on this trip, but yes, the one that I've been to is in Brookhaven, Mississippi, is the Lincoln County Historical Society.
And I'll add that Natchez, Mississippi, the synagogue is now has a small museum in it as well.
I'm curious, since you're not from the South and like doing this research, if there's anything that was really surprising to you in terms of like your own relationship to it, or like reflection points for you?
Yeah, I mean, I admittedly like moved from the north and had a lot of ideas, a lot of really negative ideas about the South before I came here, and I was first like surprised to find Jews in towns as small as like Jasper and Eufaula and things like that, and surprised at often how like accepted and integrated they were in the like larger community.
Going on to that, could you talk more about the shared experience of, collecting meaningful histories and all?
also how you can present them in species?
Yeah. I mean, it was a very moving experience, like collecting all of these oral histories. People have been really open and really candid in the interviews. And I've been really touched by that and pleasantly surprised. I tried to, like, these oral histories are often between an hour and hour and a half long. So they're quite long, and it's really hard to distill that and cut it. And so I try to, whenever I share them, leave a complete anecdote in and just pull that anecdote out and give a little bit of context about what we were talking about at the time. When I'm showing them with the photographs in like a gallery space, my preferred method is to play oral histories aloud so people can look at the photographs while kind of being surrounded by the voices. And I am hoping to transcribe all of them, but yeah. Transcription takes, it's an average of like an hour to transcribe 10 minutes of oral history. So it takes a very long time. And I have like 30 hours recorded from this trip. So.
I mean, I have a question about that. Like, is there some sort of like digital archive that's like available for those, or like where are they stored?
Right now they're stored on my hard drive, but I'm working with the University of Alabama with Dr. Daniel Levine and Dr. Bob Ryder to try to sort something out where they'll be publicly available. I think it's really important that if I want to fill a silence in the archive, that people can actually access the work.
How did you go about finding people to interview, and did you ever like have any agreement on like whether it could be public, or were they like, are they happy to like share their story to whoever?
Yeah, it was all word of mouth. Abby connected me to a couple of key people who connected me to almost everyone in the state of Alabama, I feel like. There are a lot of times where I'd interview someone and they'd be like, oh, you know who you need to interview? So-and-so over in Montgomery. And I'd be like, actually, I interviewed them last week. And it's like, it's a very small community. And sorry, what was this? Oh, they sign a release. So everybody, before I interview them, I show them a release, give them plenty of time to read it, think about it. I always let them know, like, if you don't want this, like, if you don't want to do it, that's totally fine. Like, no pressure. And that the release says that it'll be public. So, and I tell them verbally too.
Were gravestone inscriptions typically in Hebrew or in English?
Older gravestones often in Hebrew or Yiddish, but from reading them, I can't usually tell the difference myself. And newer ones, usually both Hebrew and English. Sometimes one side will be in Hebrew and one side will be in English, which is interesting.
Somebody asked, what was the most surprising thing you encountered on your trips, positive or negative?
Oh, most surprising thing. That's a hard one. Maybe the thunderstorm in Huntsville. It said it wasn't going to rain.
Any place that felt most meaningful, or like a section that was your favorite?
Oh, I can't play favorites. Everyone was lovely. I'm still in touch with some of the people from Selma pretty regularly, and I think that's really special. And of course, still in touch with someone from Eufaula.
Two more questions have come in. One is, did the fact that your great-grandmother grew up in a small community in Bowling Green, Ohio, have an effect on your choice to do this kind of work? I'm assuming is David Perlmutter a cousin?
I knew about it, but I don't think that it was necessarily a motivating factor. I think I didn't realize until I really got into the work just how similar those stories are. But now I think about it, it's gotten me more interested in my own family history, certainly.
And the last question from the chat that we'll ask is, when are you going to Texas?
Depending on what school says, somewhere between December 7th and December 16th for the duration of my winter break.
People on this call have Texas relatives. Would you like anybody to reach out?
Yeah, give them my email address.
Great. I think with that, we will conclude this presentation with Emily. I'm gonna pop in the chat. I'm gonna pop in the camera one more time to thank everybody who is virtually joining us today. We appreciate you supporting Emily Williams' work, and it is an honor to get to share her work with the greater community, as the Museum of the Southern Jewish Experience is dedicated to bringing forward these stories and having somebody actively doing this research in our 13th state Southern region is a true gift. As Emily continues her trip through the Deep South, we will continue hearing more about her work. If you would like to stay in touch with the Museum of the Southern Jewish Experience, there's a few things you can do. You can follow us on social media, learn more about the public programs that are happening here at the museum. You could always come visit. We are here in New Orleans. We would love you to come. And if you want to support the museum, you can do so by becoming a member, which you can find more information on at msje.org/support. So thank you all for being here today, and I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day. Oh, the recording of this will be available on our YouTube page in the coming days, so you can share with your friends and family. Thank you so much. Here. Okay, oh, come on. Sorry. Of course. This is the part that I get to edit out later. There you go.